In 1916, the bloated, castrated body of a man was dragged from the freezing waters of the Neva River in St. Petersburg. Almost beyond recognition, it was later identified as that of the most notorious monk in history.
He's a superhuman force of evil at the heart of the monarchy.
Hundreds of thousands of people died because of the incompetence of the government, of the ministry, and that ministry influenced by Rasputin.
It's widely believed in the upper reaches of society that this man is really the source of all of Russia's problems.
To his enemies, Grigori Rasputin was the incarnation of evil. He destroyed anyone who dared to cross his path to power. Implicated in murder, corruption, and the eventual destruction and execution of the Romanov royal family, Rasputin was instrumental in wiping out the 300-year-old dynasty and changing the history of Russia forever. In a remote village in deepest Siberia, everyone knew Grigori Efimovich. As a teenager, his shameless exploits had earned him a reputation as a thief, a drunkard, and a womanizer.
His name comes from the Russian word Rasputny, which means dissolute, so he obviously spent many of his childhood years getting drunk and getting up to no good.
By the time he was in his teenage, he was a sort of tearaway. I mean, there was a sort of gang of toughs in the village, and he was the leader. So much so that they would be paid by the priest to stay away from Sunday worship, for example, because they were so disruptive.
Unwelcome in the Orthodox Church, Rasputin began to search for an alternative path to God.
Evidently, he showed tremendous interest and curiosity and a deep sense of spirituality which others witnessed. So he was on the way to becoming an important figure in the religious scene of Russia at the time.
Rasputin was never ordained priest, and he didn't become a monk, although on occasion he claimed to or pretended to be that.
Rasputin discovered a heretical cult who believed that only after a man had sinned greatly could he truly be repentant and pleasing to God.
He's really the member of a sect, of which there were many in Russia. Rasputin's sect, probably the Khlisti as they are known, we translate that as the flagellants, the idea that they whipped themselves into a state of ecstatic frenzy where they had religious visions. And they, like many sects, believed that Christ was embodied in ordinary peasant people.
The Khlisti rituals consisted of meeting in secret places, forest glades perhaps, or cellars, where they would whip and dance and twirl and stamp and chant themselves into a state of ecstasy, into a frenzy. In Russian it's called radienie. They would then engage in group sex, in orgies. And the purpose of this was both to indulge in the sin of the flesh, in order then to be purified, to repent, and to abstain once again.
Despite Rasputin's involvement in the cult, he married a local girl and started a family. But he was not destined to play the doting father for long.
He seems to have seen the light and went on a pilgrimage, so he claims, which probably means that he spent some years wandering around Russia and picking up the reputation of some sort of mystical type.
From the very beginning, it was clear that Rasputin was different from other boys. He showed from an early age that he had something like second sight. He had these very hypnotic, powerful eyes which seemed to sort of be the center of his personality.
Assuming the role of holy man and healer, Rasputin set about corrupting countless God-fearing peasant women.
He could argue, you know, if you want to come to Christ, you want to come to God, then you have to sin first. And I can be the medium through which you can sin. And it's documented that many women fell for this line. His technique was quite straightforward and uncomplicated. He would simply tear open the girl's blouse. It's a very crude and primitive male chauvinism that he practiced.
Before long, this potent and dangerous combination would lead Rasputin to the royal capital of St. Petersburg.
St. Petersburg 1900 is a very vibrant cosmopolitan place. Orthodox members of the aristocracy are beginning to flirt with ideas of theosophy, with Ouija boards and seances. Rumours begin to circulate in the early 1900s of this guy Rasputin, who has curious healing powers.
In 1903, Rasputin arrived in St. Petersburg with an appearance far from regal. He was a shaggy figure with a sable coat thrown over peasant boots and a blouse.
He smelt a bit like a goat, apparently. He had long, rather greasy black hair, a thick black beard, which people said was covered in last week's dinner.
He parted his hair in the middle and combed it kind of over his forehead, because apparently he had a bump on his forehead he wanted to hide. Other people would say it was like a horn he was trying to hide when they want to compare him with the devil. He was pretty repulsive looking.
Even his eyes held no warm religious feeling and were often described as the eyes of a maniac. In the first few years of the 20th century, Russia was suffering massive domestic disorder, as well as the constant threat of foreign invasion. The rich sought amusement, and the church needed a boost.
So the church was looking for genuinely spiritual types from the common people. And likewise, the monarchy was similarly looking for people like Rasputin who could give it some sort of divine authority.
His reputation as a preacher had preceded him, and he had an entree into high circles within the church, and from there into the aristocracy and the royal family.
Tsar Nicholas II and Empress Alexandra lived a life of opulence and luxury, in extraordinary palaces, furnished with gold, and anything their hearts desired. The one dark cloud was that the heir to the throne, Alexei, suffered from haemophilia, an agonizing blood disorder thought incurable.
The Empress was desperate for someone to heal her son, the Tsarevich Alexis, because she had brought haemophilia into the Romanov family through her own family of Hesse. She saw her son's illness, the first male heir to be born, as a punishment from God.
In November 1906, Rasputin was summoned to the royal palace at Tsarskoye Selo to see if his mystical ability to heal could help.
It seems that he was able to stop the bleeding of Tsarevich on occasion, whether this was by hypnotism or by simply his presence, which seemed to have a calming effect, or whether it was because he comforted the mother, who was hysterical.
With the illness of Alexei becoming progressively worse, the Empress was convinced that only a miracle could save her son.
An incident in 1912 really sort of fixed his position there. The Empress was out riding with Alexis, and he had some sort of fall, and the internal bleeding began. In her desperation, the Empress telegrams Rasputin, who's at home in his village in western Siberia.
And by return, he sends a telegram back saying, "God has heard your prayers and seen your tears. The little one will not die. Tell the doctors not to bother him too much." Miracle of miracles, the next morning he recovers, the bleeding stops. That sealed it for Alexandra. A miracle had occurred.
And from that point on, Rasputin's comings and goings at the court became more frequent.
This finally secured Rasputin's position in the royal palace and his place in Russian history forever. With his position in the palace secure and the assurance of the Empress's protection, Rasputin set about abusing every rule in the holy book.
He was a dual character if ever there was one. He could go straight from the Tsarevich's bedside, where he was praying fervently for his recovery, to the brothel down the road. He would boast about his mystical powers as much about his powers as a lover. So, in a sense, you know, his two careers were going apart in parallel.
It's like a pop star suddenly being a star overnight and don't know what to do with their money or their fame and their power, in a sense. And he had this wonderful power now.
For the ladies of the aristocracy, there was undoubtedly an element of piquancy in this grubby man. This sort of peasant type wandering around the palatial apartments of the aristocracy was obviously an object of fascination.
When socializing with the aristocracy, Rasputin would take immense pleasure in insulting his social superiors.
There'd be a sexual edge to his humiliations. He would dip his grubby little finger in a pot of jam and make one of these princesses lick it clean.
She takes it from him. She does do what he says. She obeys him.
No woman was safe from his advances. The recently widowed Kionia Bilyatska turned to Rasputin for spiritual guidance. She recalled their fateful meeting in her diary.
Он предлагает мне соблазниться. He instructed me to prepare myself as a woman and began to do what a husband alone is permitted to do. He forced me, caressed me. He then did all he wanted to the end. I felt dirty, impure, for he clearly felt it necessary to subject me to perpetual testing.
Untarnished by his lewd actions, Rasputin split his time between the palatial apartments of the well-to-do and the royal chamber of the Empress herself.
So from about 1912, he's a frequent fixture in the private apartments of the Empress, where he acts, in a sense, as her confidant, her confessor. She obviously took great comfort in his presence, not least because of his calming influence on the boy.
Rasputin was well aware that as long as the prince was alive, he had run of the royal house. The Empress's trust was paramount to Rasputin's quest for fame and power.
Those who were in government positions didn't want the Empress to hear that they were fighting Rasputin. Anybody who didn't like Rasputin lost their job.
The seats of government were filling up with fortune hunters and incompetents, many of whom were happy to pay large amounts to Rasputin for the position.
The best way to describe him is as a fixer. He had acquired so much influence at court that he could really almost do anything. He could make a bishop. He could unmake a bishop. He could ensure that somebody was advanced in a ministry. He even made prime ministers and unmade them.
Russia's last chance at honest government was the Prime Minister Peter Stolypin, who was compiling a file of evidence against Rasputin.
He had to prove to the Tsar and Tsarina that this man was evil. He collected this huge file of all these scandals that was going on. The file proved that Rasputin